Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan with another of our double shot interviews, and I'm joined by Ryan Greenaway McGrevy, who's a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Auckland. Welcome in, Ryan. Good to see you again.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Ryan is primarily here to talk about the idea of a land tax. Now, the government's tax working group back in 2010, the Productivity Commission, the OECD, have all suggested that New Zealand should look seriously at the idea of a land tax. But as we head into the September 23rd election, it's not on the agenda, and we've got, again, the idea of a capital gains tax, excluding the family home, on the agenda. Now, you are, Ryan, a fan of the idea of a land tax.
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
Why?
So a lot of tax comes with bad unintended consequences, right? So whenever we implement a tax, that influences people's incentives and their behaviours, and often this happens in a counterproductive way. So we tax income right now, right? We tax work. That reduces the return to working, and that could act as a disincentive for people to take on additional work, right? So right now the Labour Party wants to increase the top marginal tax rate, which would hit high income earners. A lot of economists will come back and say, well, that reduces their incentive to work. They may work less. That's a bad thing. Now, the evidence for that is mixed, but it's certainly the case that people will spend more time and energy on avoiding their taxes if you hit them with a higher tax rate. Again, a bad outcome. If we think about taxing capital through, say, a capital gains tax, that affects a person's incentive to invest, right? And as a consequence, they may invest less in new residential construction, they may invest less in businesses, less in companies. Again, arguably a bad outcome, right? So the moral of the story here is you tax a particular activity, that reduces the incentive to perform that activity. When it comes to land, however, the amount of land is fixed, right? So if you're going to tax landowners, they can't turn around and say, well, we're going to react to that by making less land, right? So we're not going to affect the total amount of land in the economy if we choose to tax it. So that's one of the reasons why I favour it, and a lot of other economists favour it. It's a very efficient form of taxation. It's one of the reasons why the tax working group was in favour of it. Essentially because it minimises those bad unintended outcomes. It could also possibly result in some good unintended consequences as well, which we could perhaps talk about.
Yeah, just before we go on, I think just in terms of Labour and the top tax rate, I think Jacinda Ardern has ruled out doing that.
Oops.
So just to make that point.
The Green Party then. The Green Party's going to do it. Before
we hear from anyone in Labour on that. But we're here to talk about land tax anyway, so we'll move on to that. Okay, so we'll go on to those unintended consequences that could be good. But before we get on to that, how would it be structured and how would it be paid?
So usually it would be levied on the land value embedded in a property, right? So if you think about your typical residential home, freehold land title, if it's worth $1 million according to the assessor, perhaps the improvements or the residential structure is worth $300,000. You subtract that off, you're left with the value of the underlying land of, let's say, $700,000. The land tax will be levied on that figure, usually at a very low rate. So, low in percentage terms at least, say 1%, that's what the tax working group proposed. Around the world they vary from anything from 1% all the way up to 5%. But I think most of the numbers that have been kicked around are around about that 1% mark.
And so how much revenue would that bring in, roughly, for the government?
So back in 2010 it was estimated that would bring in about $4.6 billion. Okay, taking into account that land values would fall after the tax is implemented. The tax working group thought they'd fall by about 17%. This was back in 2010, of course. We've seen massive price appreciation, at least in the value of residential land. So, we might see more money being raised these days.
So, land prices would be expected to fall.
Yes.
So, is that, from your perspective, one of the good potentially unintended consequences?
I mean, there is a
there'd be some people out there who obviously say that was bad. But,
particularly if you're a landowner, right?
But in your view?
So it'll be good to this extent. If you recognise that we've got a housing affordability problem right now, and that a lot of potential first-time home buyers are deposit constrained, you've got to get up to a certain amount in order to meet that 10 or 20% as it is now under the LVRs. So bringing down house prices through reducing the value of land, could get more first-time home buyers into a home. However, you have to recognise that it's only those individuals that are deposit constrained that are going to benefit from it, because as soon as you buy that house, you have this tax liability going forward, the land tax.
Right. Now, in terms of the potential consequences of it, one of the points that you've made previously when you did a top 10 for us is it could hit land bankers.
Yes, right. So it creates a tremendous incentive to develop land to its full potential, because any improvements that you add to the land will not be taxed, and any improvements that you make will help you offset that tax liability. So, right now it makes, we arguably have a land banking problem in Auckland in particular. This would disincentivise that option value of sitting around and waiting to develop that piece of land. You really want to do it sooner rather than later when you've got this tax liability.
And you've also noted that it would hit the global elite, I guess the billionaires from overseas coming in and buying up New Zealand properties. So that's another consequence that would be deemed to be a good one? I
think so. Look, for better or worse, right now we allow foreigners to come in and buy some of the more pristine parts of the country, right? And people have different opinions on whether or not we should be doing that. I'm of the opinion that if we're going to do that, right, we should be taxing these individuals. Why? Well, right now their contribution to New Zealand is rather small, limited to council rates, and also if they're buying goods and services through GST. If you think about why New Zealand's so attractive, one, we've got a lot of natural beauty. We're also a stable liberal democracy that's developed, right? So these people are benefiting from the fact that the New Zealand economy is stable and relatively prosperous. They should be contributing to it in one way or another. A land tax would achieve that. And it would do so in a very efficient way as well, because it's very hard to avoid.
Now, I guess one point that landowners might come back at you with is, well, I already pay as a landowner, I already pay my council, my local government rates. How does a land tax, is it double dipping on that? How does it work in with rates? Yeah,
so the way that the tax working group and the way that I see a land tax is that it will be levied at the central government level, okay? And it would come with tax breaks elsewhere, right? So we'd implement a land tax and perhaps reduce income tax or reduce GST. And the goal would be that, the average New Zealander would be left no better or worse off, right? But it's definitely the case that there would be taxation of land both at at least property at the council level and then again at the government level.
But you're talking about some tax relief elsewhere, so overall, do you think the land tax would be revenue neutral for the government, or would it create more revenue off the current base?
So it depends how it's implemented, right? If it's implemented as part of a broader tax reform and restructuring, and for the record, I'm only in favour of it to the extent that it could be used to offset, say, a reduction in GST or a reduction in income tax. But yeah, if you implement it without tax relief elsewhere, obviously it's going to increase overall tax revenue for the government.
Quite significantly, potentially.
Yeah. So $4.6 billion, nothing to sneeze at there.
No. Well, look, it's a very interesting concept, I think, and it'd be nice if it got a bit more airtime in this discussion. I guess one possibility could be that if Labour do win the election and they form this tax working group, then it may be an issue that comes up in that again, as it did in the national government's one in 2010.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll depend on who they pick to be in that panel, but last time around, it's chaired by Arthur Grimes, and they were very clear with their recommendations. They're in favour of land tax, in favour of a reduction of GST. National government turned around and chose to ignore that advice. But yeah, it'll be interesting, as you say, it'll be interesting to see what happens this time around if Labour get in there.
Yeah. Look, and while we've got you here too, I just thought if we just pick up on housing affordability more broadly. Now, you've written some very interesting articles for us on this and the Herald and elsewhere, and you've done some studies. One of the lines that you've used, which is very straight and to the point, is our politicians must declare a war on house prices in Auckland. Now, I mean, this is all about affordability, but why and how are they going to, should they do this in your view?
So why, to begin with, if you look at the research that's been done on the effect of house prices on metropolitan growth, if you increase house prices, it constricts metropolitan growth. There's a mountain of peer-reviewed research to show that. So two examples that are given: San Francisco, cost of living very high house prices, has not grown by nearly as much as the city of Houston in the US, has a much more or better housing affordability. So if we want Auckland to continue to grow, it's critical that we bring house prices down. Why should we want Auckland to grow? Essentially because cities are incredibly productive places, right? This is why they exist. So if we want to allow our own domestic industries working in, say, STEM or IT, these are going to be located in cities, right? And so if we want to encourage these firms in Auckland, we have to do something about the cost of living here to allow the city to continue to grow and to build these sectors. And
so, I mean, you're a fan of density, greater density, is that?
Yes, yeah. So I'm a fan of density. If you look at Auckland, we're not really blessed when it comes to space, right? We've got 2 harbours. We're not like Atlanta, where you can just go out in every direction. It's clear that if Auckland's going to grow in terms of population, in terms of employment, in terms of its economy, we're going to have to fit more people into a smaller amount of space. And I mean, if you look at this, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have large high-rises. We're not at that point yet. That would be nice if it was part of the solution, but you look at cities like London, cities like outside of Manhattan in New York, cities like Washington DC, there's a lot of row housing, or what we call terraced housing. We don't have a lot of that in Auckland yet, but we could.
And I mean, ultimately, so we've got average house selling for 9 to 10 times the average annual household income now. Auckland Council wants to, I think by 2030, they want to basically have that halved.
Yeah.
Is that a feasible target, do you think?
The only way it's feasible is if you bring down the price of dwellings, right? So a lot of supply has to come online, or worse, you have a massive crash as a result of something else going on with the economy. There's no way that incomes can double in that amount of time, not with our lacklustre productivity growth in New Zealand. We're simply not that lucky. So a statement like that is basically saying we have to reduce the price of dwellings coming onto the market. Yeah. Sorry, and one reason I'm a fan of density is that we could achieve that without having all property owners take a massive hit. When you allow for greater density, right, that inflates the value of land, right? But when that piece of land is developed to house, say, 3 or 4 dwellings, when it used to house only 1, that's additional supply coming onto the market. That's restoring affordability. So one reason I am a fan of density is it means that we can bring down the price of dwellings while maintaining the price of land and therefore a lot of the property values around Auckland.
And potentially avoiding a crash.
And avoiding a crash, yeah. I mean, we're in this situation in which the number of escape routes are rather limited. Bringing down, if house prices fell by 50% tomorrow, that would be a massive shock for the economy, put us into a big recession, right? But at the same time, if we continue down this path where housing is unaffordable, that's slowly going to strangle Auckland. It's going to strangle the New Zealand economy. So we have to get out of this situation. Allowing for greater density is one way to do it.
Well, look, thanks a lot for that, Ryan. That's Ryan Greenaway McGrevy, Senior Lecturer in Economics at the University of Auckland, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.